Hello all, hope you all are doing good. In today's session, we are going to learn transactions in database management system and different states that are included in transaction. Firstly, let us define what a transaction is. It is a logical unit of work that consists of one or more related tasks. And it is treated as a single indivisible operation, which makes that either all the tasks within the transaction are executed successfully or none are executed. In simple words, you can define transaction as a set of logical operations, or it is a collection of logical operations in order to perform a specific task, and it is known as transaction. For example, if a user would like to perform a withdraw transaction, okay, withdrawal is a transaction that the user would like to initiate. In that case, what are the several operations that are included in order to have the successful withdrawal transaction? Firstly, the user has to insert the card, right? And next, he has to select for the language. From the screen, he has to choose the language which he is comfortable with in order to perform this withdraw transaction. And next, he has to select either savings or current account. And now he needs to enter the amount how much he wanted to withdraw. Once the amount is entered, then what happens? It is either asking for a PIN or the transaction will get initiated or the transaction will be under the process. Once the transaction is completed, then the amount he has to collect, right? Also, he needs to collect what? He needs to collect card from the machine, and then he may have to click on the finish button. Thereby, the transaction is going to end. So these are the different operations that the user had performed in order to complete withdrawal transaction. And that is why we define the transaction as a set of logical operations, right? And we have different types of operations, like we have read operation and write operation. So when read operation is performed, it is not going to affect anything on the database. That means read operation, when it is executed, it is only used to read the data from the database. When write operation is performed, it is used to make changes to or from the database. So this is the different types of operations that are present in the transactions. Now let us move on to the properties of transactions. Properties of transactions has been defined in order to maintain the consistency in the database. Consistency in database, that is before and after the transaction. Let us read out the properties and understand what it is. Firstly, atomicity. This property states that the transaction must be treated as an atomic unit. That is, either all its operations are executed or none. So in the previous example, we have seen withdrawal of transaction. Assume that the user has read the amount initially before the transaction has been started, and he found that the amount present in his account is of rupees 1000. Now when he wanted to withdraw some amount of 500 rupees, so during this process, when the transaction is under the process, due to some system failure, let us assume that the amount of 500 has been lost. Then, is there anything who is responsible in ensuring that this particular transaction is rolled back to account A, such that initially what is the amount that is present in account A is equal to the amount that is present after the transaction? The lost amount has to be transferred back to the account A and initiate that it is 1000 before the transaction. That means the amount which he has withdrawn has not been made a successful transaction. Therefore, this particular 500 rupees has to be rolled back in such a way that the transaction has not done at all. Thereby, the user can initiate a new transaction and perform the withdrawal transaction again. So that is what either all the operations are to be executed successfully, or it has to ensure that none of the operation has been taken place if any kind of errors takes place. So thereby what happens, the user will again start or restart the transaction. So that is about the atomicity. Coming to consistency, the database must remain in a consistent state after any transaction. It is says that if the database was in a consistent state before a transaction, then after execution of the transaction, the database must be back to its consistent state. So let us take the same example which we have discussed. Initially, the account A holds 1000 rupees, and after performing withdrawal operation, 500 rupees has been deducted from account A. Now the thing is, what is the remaining amount that is present in account A? It is 500. So 500 plus 500 is what? Which is 1000. So before the transaction, the total amount present in account A is 1000. And after the transaction, the remaining amount and withdrawal amount, when you sum these two, you get the same, that is 1000. So which means what? The database is in a consistent state. Coming to isolation, each transaction is considered independent of other transactions. That is, the execution of multiple transactions concurrently will have the same effect as if they have been executed one after the other. But isolation does not ensure which transaction will execute first. Now let us assume there are transactions, say T1 and T2. Isolation means one after the other, the transactions has to be performed. That means these two transactions are independent to each other. Now, when a read operation is performed on account A and found that 1000 rupees is available in account A, now from account A, if 500 is to be deducted to perform a withdraw transaction, write operation is performed on account A in order to update the database saying that the amount that is present in account A is 500 after the withdraw operation. But during this process of transaction, if there is another person who would like to perform a read operation, then for that person, say B, it again shows the amount of 1000 rupees. After deducting 500, this 500 is the last commit state, which means the changes are already made to the database. So thereby the amount that is present in account A is now only 500 because 500 is already deducted from it. But when user B is trying to access the same account, what is the amount that it is showing to user B? 1000 is the amount that it is showing. It is because this transaction T2 is interleaving when the operations of transaction 1 are made. So thereby it leads to what? An inconsistent state. This is the difference where both the users may see if the transactions are not isolated or they are independent to each other. Coming to durability, the changes made to the database by a successful transaction persist even after a system failure. So though there is any system failure, durability ensures that the database has to be updated successfully. It might be any state of transaction, that is whether the transaction has been failed or the transaction is terminated successfully or the transaction has been recovered back after the failure. Any sort of transaction states has to be successfully updated in the database. So that is the durability. The changes made to the database by a successful transaction persist even after a system failure. and this durability has been taken care by the transaction manager. Transaction states. Here we have different states of transaction. Whenever a user initiates some transaction, every of the transaction has to undergo the following states, either of these following states. Firstly, let us see what is an active state. Active states is when the transaction has been started, then you say that the transaction is in active state. Partially committed state. Let us take the example of withdrawing the amount. The same example as we have discussed. Once the user inserts the card into the ATM machine, then the transaction has been initiated. We can say that the transaction is now in the active state, right? Now, once the read or write operations is made by the user, that means to perform a withdrawal transaction, the user has to perform several operations like choosing the language from the interface. He has to also select the account, that is either the savings or the current account. Then he has to enter the PIN number. Then the PIN number has to be internally verified whether it is valid or not. And then he has to check for the amount that is available in the account. And then he has to enter the amount which he wanted to withdraw. All these are the several operations that the user has to perform. So when those operations the user is making, we say that the transaction is a partially committed state. Suppose that the user found that there is some insufficient funds available and thereby he cannot withdraw the amount from the account. In that case, what happens? The transaction from partially committed state, it moves to a failed state. Why failed state? Because he has unable to complete the withdrawal transaction due to insufficient balance. When the transaction is in an entered state, it again moves to the aborted state. Once this aborted state, the transaction has been moved, it will roll back all the operations so far what the user has made. That is inserting the card, selecting the language, selecting the account, entering the amount. All these operations will get rolled back and then the transaction will move to the terminated state. As the transaction has to end, whether it is a successful or it is a failed transaction, there must be a terminated state. The transaction from aborted state, it will move to the terminated state. Now let us say the other case of withdrawing the transaction. When can we say that the transaction is successful? So same operations, inserting the card and making the transaction initiation will allow the transaction to be in an active state. Now performing the read or write operations by the user will make the transaction enter into a partially committed state. Once he found that the amounts are sufficient to withdraw from his account, then after performing the withdrawal transaction successfully, the transaction from partially committed state, it will move to the committed state, which means the withdrawal operation has been done successfully. From committed state, as it is necessary to end the transaction, once the user will click on the finish button, then the user from the committed state, the transaction will move on to the terminated state.